Okay, so if we move now a little more anterior, right, from the occipital lobe, and we are ventral, right, or let's see, inferior to the lateral or sylvian fissure, right, we get this great big thumb of tissue here, right, of cortical tissue here, that's referred to as the temporal lobe. This is the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is very important for visual perception. But in terms of recognizing or identifying what specific objects actually are. So it turns out that, for example, if you damage the ventral anterior portion of the temporal lobe, you can actually lose the ability to recognize individuals by their faces. You can no longer, identify people by faces. And this is a pretty serious condition called prosopagnosia. Actually, there are people who are born with this. It's been estimated about 6% of people have something that's not quite properly functioning in this part of the temporal lobe, so that they are unable to identify individuals by faces. And if you go a little bit further back and there's damage, people can have difficulty distinguishing like an elephant from a giraffe. So you can have problems with categorizing and identifying another class of objects. So particularly on the ventral temporal regions, there appears to be, with experience, this is not something that's necessarily immediately present at birth, although some of the face recognition aspects perhaps are come earlier. But there are, with experience, these regions in the temporal lobe become organized based upon, it seems, various categories of objects. So it allows you to identify what it is that you are looking at. So again, think about this. Visual information, right, coming from your eyes is going to be heading towards cortex. Remember, it must make an obligatory stop in a central set of nuclei called, the thalamus. There's a specific nucleus called the LGN, which receives visual information from the retinas, and then projects it back into occipital lobe, which is, the lobe that is, concerned primarily with visual processing. And then information will start to flow out of these areas, dorsally, right, up towards the parietal lobe, which will help to inform your spatial map, of your body and its relationship with objects and events, in your environment. And it will also start to, head ventrally, or ventrally in an anterior fashion, right, along the temporal lobe, where it helps to inform various, your understanding of what it is that you are looking at, in terms of object identification, right? Now, the temporal lobe, in addition to playing an essential role in, object identification, also plays a pretty significant role in audition, right? Hearing. So here's our sylvian or lateral fissure, right? And this top gyrus, this most superior gyrus you see here, is the superior temporal gyrus. Well, sort of in the middle portion here, and extending inside, extending medially along the top plane, right, of the temporal lobe. It's called the planum temporale. You will actually see a number of gyri that extend. So this is taking your temporal lobe. Here's the temporal lobe on the side. We're going to the planum temporale, now heading medially, right? And there are a number of sulci and gyri that head kind of in a medial direction. These are called Heschl's gyri. And these are essential. This is the site of primary auditory cortex. This is where auditory information from the cochlea, from the ears, actually initially arrives in cortex. So auditory processing is also very important function of the temporal lobe. We'll see that a little bit more, posterior along the superior temporal gyrus, right, is an area known as Wernicke's area, which is also very important for auditory processing, auditory language processing, and language comprehension. The other thing to think about in terms of the temporal lobe is if you were to go towards the medial temporal lobe, right? Right along this is, we're looking at the ventral surface here, but I'm gonna remove this temporal lobe here, right? And then we can sort of see, here is the medial portion, right? In here is a structure called the hippocampus, and we talked about this in relationship to the limbic system, right? And hopefully you can remember what the hippocampus is important for. The hippocampus is important for memory, particularly a form of memory called declarative memory, which is memory for facts and events, like the kind of stuff you're supposed to be learning right now, like the hippocampus is essential for memory. That's a form of declarative memory. And I'd like you to associate memory function, declarative memory function in particular, with the temporal lobe.